Well, as I was growing up, we were growing up under a very strong, oppressive military dictatorship. I mean, the Batista regime was very corrupt. It was a military regime, and the military exerted a lot of influence upon the people. They were extorting money from the people, killing dissidents. And of course, the revolution started in the high schools and the universities. Initially, it started with student protests. I was in the student council, and so I was involved in student protests and student marches, which were met with billy clubs. And after that, I remember a young, charismatic leader that rose up, talking about hope and change. His name was Fidel Castro. And we all followed him. We thought he was going to be our liberator. Little did we know. And so I became involved in the underground, fighting in the resistance movement. And I was involved in that, mostly sabotage, things of this sort, movement of weapons, training, that sort of thing. And ultimately, I was captured, I was imprisoned and tortured, but by the grace of God, I was able to leave Cuba and come to the greatest country on the face of the earth. I left Cuba in late 1957, came to the University of Texas on a student visa, and when Castro took over in 1959, I went back to Cuba that summer, and I was shocked. That same man that had been talking about hope and change was now talking about how the rich were evil, about how they oppressed the poor, and about the need to redistribute the wealth. Fidel began confiscating private property, began attacking freedom of the press, shutting down newspapers, television stations, radio stations, began attacking freedom of religion, began imposing Marxism to be taught on the schools. So I left Cuba totally disillusioned, never to return again, but so grateful to God to be in the greatest country on the face of the earth. You know, I consider that outside of the Bible, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States of America are the two greatest documents that have ever been written, because the framers were people of principle. They were people that gave all to give us the freedoms that we have today. I think the last paragraph in the Declaration says it so clearly, which says, relying upon the protection of divine providence. This framer said, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And they literally laid it all on the line to give us the freedom that we have enjoyed for almost over 200 years. I think the United States has been historically the bastion of freedom throughout the world. Countries throughout the world have looked up to America as an example of what a free society is. And it is sad that today the government has moved away from those principles that have made America great. You know, as I came to the University of Texas, I basically couldn't speak English, didn't have practically any money. I got my first job was as a dishwasher. And the reason I got a job as a dishwasher was very simple. You don't need to speak English to wash dishes. You just wash the dishes, you get paid, that was it. And plus, you got your food for free. So then later on, I became a cook at that university, and after I graduated, I went to work for IBM as a computer programmer. Within 6 years after leaving school, I had my own business in oil and gas exploration. I had a seismic data processing company, and initially in Canada, at the beginning of 1975, I sold that company and started all over again in Houston. And we had that company until mid-'80s, when OPEC basically opened the valves and flooded the market. And overnight, oil went from $35 a barrel to $7 a barrel. Unfortunately, my clients were small to medium-sized independent oil companies. Many of those went bankrupt. Unfortunately, some of them went bankrupt, owing me a whole bunch of money, so they took me under. I tell you, when I lost my business, I didn't just lose my business, I even lost my home. We really struggled. I mean, I all of a sudden I found myself in a city which was devastated. We were really in a depression in Houston. There were tens of thousands of homes that had been foreclosed. Nobody could find a job. So when you can't find a job, what do? You become a commission salesman. And as a commission salesman, if you don't sell, you don't eat. And let me tell you, that gives you a lot of incentive to sell. So I sold all kinds of things. I sold vending machines. I sold insurance. I sold nutritional products, and did what I had to do to survive. It was very difficult, especially considering that we lost our business almost at about the time that our son Ted was ready to go to college. He wanted to go to Princeton, and we didn't have any money, but he had a dream.
Excuse me 1 second. We didn't have any money. Go from there.
We didn't have any money. We were really struggling. I was trying to make ends meet. Both my wife and I were working. She was also selling insurance. And our son Ted wanted to go to Princeton. As a matter of fact, we had taken a week and driven through all the universities in the Northeast. We traveled to 8 different universities where he had made application. And he settled on Princeton. And actually, Princeton, when they accepted it, they said, look, if he is accepted, we'll make sure he can go here. So they looked at our financial situation. They gave him some scholarship. They gave him a job. And we were so grateful that Princeton gave him the opportunity to work at the same time as going to school and being able to get the education that he wanted. Well, I think Ted realized that you can't just rest on your laurels.
Sorry, I think Ted realized.
I think Ted realized during that time that you cannot rest on your laurels. Just because we had a business that was very successful, it wasn't a guaranteed utopia. We saw that business disappear overnight. We saw our having to lay off 25 employees and really struggle as we saw the whole business disappear. And, you know, one of the things that I had told Ted over and over again, Ted, this is the land of opportunity. This is a land where with hard work and perseverance, all your dreams can become a reality. You know, the Bible says, and I would say to Ted, the Bible says, though the righteous falls 7 times, he gets up again. And I would tell him, I said, you know, Ted, we're going to struggle in life. We're going to struggle. We're going to fall. But when you fall, you have 2 choices. You can stay down there and feel sorry for yourself, or you can wipe your bloody nose and get up with twice the determination. And we choose to do the second. And I think that's a lesson that he learned. And the other thing that I told him was something that my father told me so many times. And he would say, integrity. It takes a lifetime to develop. It takes a second to lose it. And I think he learned those lessons well. Ted is such a disciplined young man. And when he has a dream, he will move mountains to make that dream become a reality. Ted is a disciplined man. And I'll tell you, he will make a great president of the United States.
Okay, let's go.
At the beginning of 1975, I was really a drunk. I was drunk very heavily. That really caused a lot of problems in our marriage. I was actually separated from my wife. I came to Houston, left my wife and my son Ted in Calgary, came to Houston, and we had some clients in the oil business in Houston, so I started working with them. And I remember a man who had sold me a computer in Calgary, a man from Houston, who invited me to go to a Bible study at his home. It was on a Monday night. I had nothing to do, so I figured, well, why not? I went there. I don't even know what the Bible study was about. But what impressed me was that at the end of the Bible study, they had a time of prayer. And everybody shared their prayer requests. And I realized these people all had problems. As a matter of fact, I remember a lady. She lived alone with her son, who was a drug addict. And this son would beat her to get money for drugs. And yet this woman had a peace that I couldn't understand. They all had a peace that I did not have. So that was what intrigued me. They had something that I didn't have and I really needed. I remember as I left home that evening, the lady at the house gave me a little booklet. And she said, would you take this home and look at it and come back the next Monday? So I said, sure. I came back the next Monday and she said, what do you think? It was a little booklet called The 4 Spiritual Laws. And I said, well, that's too easy. It can't be that easy. Well, she didn't know how to answer me. And she said, do me a favor, could you come back tomorrow night? Our pastor is going to be at our home. I said, sure, 7 o'clock. So the next evening, it was Tuesday, I went to their home, 7 o'clock at night. And you got to remember, I was a scientist. I spent 4 hours arguing with this preacher. I had all the answers. I remember the last question I asked this preacher. I said, let me ask you a question. How about that man up in the mountains of Tibet that's never heard about Jesus? And this preacher very wisely didn't follow that rabbit. He said to me, to tell you the truth, I don't know about that man up in the mountains of Tibet who's never heard about Jesus, but you heard about Jesus. What's your excuse? It was as he had hit me with a sledgehammer in the middle of the forehead. And I fell to my knees and surrendered my life to Christ. It's the greatest decision of my life. It totally turned my life around. Within a week, I was back in Calgary asking my wife to forgive me and trying to explain to her what had happened in my life. She really didn't understand, but for the sake of Ted, she decided we'll give it another try. We sold our company in Calgary and came back to Houston and started the old business again in Houston.
Tell me the 4 spiritual laws, please.
The 4 spiritual laws is, first of all, man is a sinner. And as a sinner, he cannot deserve a relationship with God. Because God is perfect, he cannot have a relationship with sin. Law number 2 is that God loves us and desires to have an eternal relationship with us. Law number 3 is that there is, as a result of the first 2, there is really a big divide between us and Jesus Christ. Us and God. And Jesus Christ provides the bridge between us and having a relationship with God. And law number 4 is that Jesus Christ went to the cross to become our substitute and pay for our sins. And as we receive that payment for ourselves, we are accepted by God and can have an eternal relationship with him. You know, religion has played a role in American politics from the very beginning. You know, America is a very unique country. America was founded by men and women coming here seeking the freedom to worship God. When those pilgrims left England, if you were not a member of the Church of England, you were a heretic and you were persecuted. So from the very beginning, America's foundations was deeply based upon the Word of God, upon the Bible. And then at the time of the framers, it was the Bible that was the inspiration for the framers. It was the inspiration both for the Declaration and for the Constitution. And I think that that gave us a moral foundation. As a matter of fact, one of the framers said the Constitution is only applicable to a good and moral people. And I think the religious, the Bible gave us a moral compass, a moral foundation, which I believe is what has made America great. It has given America a background, a basis, a foundation of integrity. Judeo-Christian ideals are pervasive all throughout the Constitution and the Declaration. And as a matter of fact, many of the things that we see in the Constitution come from the book of Deuteronomy, come from different portions of the Bible, and they were basically the framework that guided the framers, who were deeply religious people. Most people don't know it, but for example, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 31 of them were seminary graduates. These were deeply committed people of God, people of faith. As Ted was growing up, since remember when I came to Christ, Ted was only 4 years old. So I tried to share with him at his age, in the way I could, the relationship that I had with Christ. I bought him a children's Bible, which was in the form of stories. And I would read the children's Bible to him when he went to bed. And he always would tell me after I finished one story, one more story, one more story. And we really cherish those stories. Perhaps the initial motivation was just staying awake a few more minutes, but yet those stories became part of his life. And Ted actually gave his heart to Christ when he was 8 years old. And that has become a foundation in his life.
When you say he gave his heart to Christ, what was the actual event?
Well, he had gone to a youth camp at the church that we were attending, and at the youth camp, he gave his heart to Christ. He was baptized the following Sunday, and really, then afterwards, as a matter of fact, when he was perhaps 11 years old, he went on a mission trip to Honduras, and he shared the gospel with the ex-mayor of the capital of Honduras, and led this grown man to pray to make Jesus Christ Lord of his life. My son Ted came home up in the clouds. I mean, he was so excited that as an 11-year-old boy, he led a grown man to surrender his life to Jesus Christ. You know, as we lost our business, it became very, very difficult. I mean, the struggle was to try to put food on the table. We had just lost our home. We were trying to, both his mother and I, work hard enough to be able to pay the rent, to put food on the table. We had to forget about even going out to get a pizza. There was barely enough food for us to eat at home. And we had to struggle. We had to cut corners. There was no way of even going to a movie or going to eat out or anything of the sort, because those were luxuries that we couldn't afford. We really had to tighten our belts. And I'll tell you what, I'm thankful to God for that experience, because that experience taught Ted about the importance of hard work and about the fact that no matter how hard the struggle, with hard work and perseverance, we can overcome. And I'll tell you, you could see the determination in his heart. As a matter of fact, even before we lost the business, as a young child, when we still had the business, I had a Coke machine at the business, and so that became Ted's little business. He would buy the soft drinks to fill the machines, and I told him, after we pay for the rental of the machine, all the profits are yours. And I would take him to the store to buy. He was a young child, and he would fill the machine and manage the machine. That was his first business. And then, as he was entering high school, he also helped us sometimes as computer operator. And I paid him just like I paid the other computer operators. And so he learned the value of $1 at an early age. And of course, after we lost our business, he realized that the only way he could make it through college is to be able to not only have some partial scholarships, but to be able to work to make up the difference. And so he developed a work ethic very early in his life. And as I said, I think that those years of struggle after we lost the business were invaluable in shaping his value system. I think actually, we tried to give Ted a Christian education at home, and as he was ready to enter high school, Ted has been always a very bright child. He was extremely bright. So there was a very good school, private school in Houston that had accepted him. And his mother and I took him to a track meet at that school prior to enrollment time. And as we were watching the track meet, Ted was with the kids, we overheard a series of women talking among themselves. And they were talking about that they had found a group so that when the kids went out and partied and got drunk, they could go and pick up the kids to take them home so they couldn't have to drive drunk coming home. And my wife and I looked at one another and we said, this is not what we need our son. And we decided that it was important to have a Christian foundation where partying and alcohol was not the focus of high school, but learning and having an ethical and biblical and moral foundation. And it served us well. I think that served him well into giving him a solid Judeo-Christian foundation, which he follows even today.
Tell me about the Free Enterprise Center that you sent him to.
The Bible says that our steps are ordered of the Lord. And it was so wonderful that as Ted was entering high school, through a client of mine who knew that Ted was so bright, and Ted had been involved in speech contests, was very good. The very first speech contest he entered was a citywide speech contest in Houston, and he won second place. It was a 20-minute speech that he wrote, and I coached him for about a month. I had it written, and we went over it over and over again. When he delivered that speech, I had the text in front of me. He didn't miss one word. He memorized that entire speech, won second place. This client, who knew the president of the Free Enterprise Institute, recommended that we get Ted involved. And it was the greatest decision for us. So we get Ted involved in the Free Enterprise Institute. And so they had Ted reading Milton Friedman and Adam Smith and John Locke and von Mises and Montesquieu and Bastiat and the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And then they decided, the Free Enterprise Institute decided to create a group of 5 kids, called them the Constitutional Corroborators. Ted was one of those 5. They hired a memory expert, and they had each of these 5 kids memorize the entire U.S. Constitution. They use what they call a mnemonic device, where the kids will memorize a string of letters, and from the letters they will recreate the text. For the following 4 years, these kids would travel around the state of Texas. They would come, say, to a Rotary Club at lunchtime, and while people were having lunch, they would put 5 easels in the front of the room, and these 5 kids would write the Constitution on those easels by memory. And then give about a half-hour patriotic speech on free market economics and the Constitution. During the next 4 years, they did approximately 80 speeches on free market economics and the Constitution. So before Ted left high school, he was passionate about the Constitution. He was passionate about the Declaration. He was passionate about free markets, about the rule of law, about the Constitution, about limited government. And that passion became like fire in his bones. And let me tell you the reason I know that Ted will continue to follow that path is that that fire is as alive today as it was 30 years ago. We take a little break and take a little water. You know, when Ted was in junior high, he would say, you know, I want to be a computer programmer. I want to study artificial intelligence. And I remember that after he said that a few times, I said, Ted, you are a people person. You will go bananas sitting in a cubicle. And so he looked at me and he said, you know, Dad, you're right. And after he went to the experience of the constitutional corroborators, I'll tell you what, he knew exactly what he wanted to do in his life. He knew that his life was committed to be a servant in this country. He was so passionate about the Constitution that he knew that that was his purpose in life. That's why he said, I have to go to one of the Ivies. Now you got to realize we're broke. We just lost our business. And he says, I got to go to one of the Ivies. And I remember his mother and I, we said, you know, we don't have any money, but we'll make it happen. So he, on his own, he set up appointments at each and every one of the Ivies. We took a week and we drove our old clunker from one to another. He had all these interviews, and I was so amazed because I had not been through that process before. And basically, what the interviews were all about is these people would ask Ted a question: why should we accept you? What can you offer this university? And of course, Ted was so eloquent in this as to, because he was passionate. He was passionate about the role that he wanted to play in America. And so it was no surprise when he got the acceptance letter from Princeton, which was his first choice. And then to find out that, well, I have to study public policy. And his thesis advisor ended up being Robbie George, which is one of the foremost constitutional scholars in this country. It was something like divine providence. And I'll tell you, he has truly a servant spirit. You know, the framers envisioned a government system that would have checks and balances. When they set up the Constitution with separation of powers, unlimited government, the idea was to have the federal government do just a few things and leave the rest to the states. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution describes it very clearly. 18 powers enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. If it ain't there, federal government's got no business being involved in it. And then the 9th and 10th Amendment tells us very clearly, everything else is reserved to the states. That's what the framers envisioned. Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, they expect what never was and never will be. More importantly, he said, the Constitution is like chains to bind the mischief of government. Today, we're seeing a lot of mischief as government becomes involved in a lot of areas that they shouldn't be involved. And Ted understands that. He understands something else. You find so many politicians that go to Washington and forget where they came from. They think that we, the people, work for them. But it is not coincidental that the first three words in the Constitutions are we, the people. You see, historically, if you look for the last thousands of years, the model for government has always been the same. It has been a man-made system, which is authority flows from God to the government to the people. And tyrants and kings have used that model to justify their oppression to the people. And they say, well, I get my authority from God, so I have the right to oppress you. But you see, the framers came up with a different model. I believe it was by divine inspiration. And the model they came up in the Constitution is no longer authority flows from God to the government to the people, but its authority flows from God to the people to the government. From God to the people to the government, and all authority rests upon we the people. Ted understands very, very clearly that model, and that government is a servant to the people, not the other way around. And I am so happy that he does understand that. He really has that servant spirit. And what he wants to do is to be a servant to we the people, to all Americans, be a servant and be able to exert that servant leadership that will make America great again. I think probably one of the most humorous stories about Ted is when Ted was, I guess, 4 or 5 years old. He was at my sister's house, and my sister had a little dog, and my mother was making Cuban meat turnovers, which I call empanadas. And my mother had flour scattered over the kitchen counter, and she would roll these meat turnovers in this flour, and little Ted grabbed this dog and rolled him over the flour, and that dog jumped from that counter, spreading flour all over the living room. My mother was screaming, and the rest of us were laughing our heads off. I remember another time we were at the beach, and this fisherman had brought on his net a little octopus, and he had that octopus on his arm, clinging to his arm, and Ted said, "Oh, I want the octopus on my arm." He must have been 10, 11 years old. So he sticks his arm out, and this man puts this little octopus on his arm, and the octopus bit Ted. And I'll tell you what, he had a scream, and I mean, he had a red puncture on his, and neither his mother and I knew what to do. She looked it up and found out that all that we could find, well, normally an octopus bite, there's normally nothing you can do about it, but some have been fatal. And I'll tell you, we had about a week that we were on pins and needles trying to look at his arm daily, making sure it wasn't going to swell up, what was going to happen, because it also, what we read was, there was nothing we could do about it. We took him to the doctor, and the doctor says, "I don't know what to do about an octopus bite." He didn't had even heard of an octopus bite. You know, America has lost its way. For too long, politicians have strayed from that clear path that the framers envisioned of limited government, of serving the people, and unfortunately, we have politicians that just want to preserve the status quo. They get to Washington, and that their first objective is not to serve we the people, but to get reelected. And unfortunately, we got politicians in Washington that have been there for 30 years. They have no clue what are the needs of the people they're representing. I think what Ted brings to the government, that Ted brings to the nation, is a vision for America. And it comes from a heart that really cares, that really loves this country and really wants to be a servant to the people. I think, you know, our heritage, I grew up in Cuba, so Ted's heritage is from Cuba, from my side. From the mother's side is Irish and Italian. But you know, even though it's a different heritage, Ted will be a president to all the people. His vision is to be able to represent every American, regardless of race, creed, or social or economic position. He wants to be a president to all the people. Yo creo que necesitamos darnos cuenta que por muchos años ya gobernantes van a Washington Y su primera prioridad no es el bienestar del pueblo, sino qué tienen que hacer para ser reelectos. Y básicamente no quieren mover el tapete, no quieren hacer nada. Yo creo que como hijo de inmigrante, Ted entiende las aspiraciones, los sueños, los deseos y las luchas y los retos que hijos de inmigrantes tienen en este país. Y Ted quiere ser un presidente para todo el pueblo, sin importar raza o nacionalidad o credo o posición económica o social, ser un presidente para todo el pueblo. Él tiene un deseo de servir a este país, un amor por este país y un amor por ver este país ser de nuevo un bastión de libertad a través del mundo y de oportunidad para todo americano. My son Ted Cruz will bring back to America opportunity for everyone. You have heard me, many of you have heard me speak about freedom to pastors, to churches, to people in general. And I believe that we need the freedom to be what God intends for us to be, to have the freedom to achieve our dreams, no matter how high they are. Ted Cruz will bring back to America freedom and opportunity. I want to ask each and every one of you, if you want the freedom to pursue your dreams, if you want the opportunity to see your dreams become a reality, no matter how great they are, I'm going to ask you to please help Ted Cruz become the next president of the United States. I ask you, whatever you can, make a donation, make a contribution to his campaign, and together let us restore the American dream. Let us make America again that shining city on a hill. I ask you, please, send whatever contribution you can. Together we will make this country great again, and we will enjoy the greatest prosperity we've ever seen. Mi hijo Ted Cruz traerá a Estados Unidos de nuevo oportunidad de alcanzar tus sueños. No importa qué tan grandes sean tus sueños, la oportunidad de alcanzarlos, la libertad de ser todo lo que tú quieras ser y ser un presidente para todo el pueblo. Yo quiero pedirte que por favor, si tú quieres ver tus sueños hechos realidad, si tú quieres ver la grandeza de este país restaurada, si tú quieres ver un presidente para todo el pueblo, yo te quiero pedir que hagas una contribución económica con lo que puedas para ayudarnos a conjuntamente hacer de América de nuevo ese gran país que trae independencia, trae libertad, trae prosperidad para todos y cada uno de nosotros. Por favor, contribuye en lo que pueda y vamos a hacer de nuevo a América, a Estados Unidos, el país más grandioso del mundo. Yo soy un ministro del Evangelio y necesitamos personas de fe como mi hijo Ted Cruz al frente de este país para restaurar los valores que han hecho a América el país tan grandioso que es. Quiero pedirles a las personas de fe, tanto evangélicos como católicos, que apoyen a Ted Cruz, no solo económicamente, sino que lo apoyen en oración. Él necesita sus oraciones y también necesita sus contribuciones. Llevémoslo a ser el próximo presidente de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. I am a minister of the gospel, and I want to speak especially to the people of faith, evangelicals as well as Catholics. We need to restore we need to restore the spiritual foundations of this country. And we need this country again to be ruled by people of faith with a moral and ethical value system that will restore what America has been historically. I want to ask you to please support Ted, not only financially, but also in prayer. We need your prayers, but we also need your contributions. Let's make Ted Cruz the greatest president that America has ever had so that we can see faith and opportunity and prosperity restored to this great country. Please help us. You know, Ted, I, I remember, I think one of the greatest experiences in my life, a couple of years ago when you were being sworn in as U.S. Senator. I was sitting on the chamber, and as I was watching you being sworn in, I could hardly contain the tears from my eyes. And the only thing that came from my mind was how 55 years before I had come to this country, I had nothing, couldn't even speak the language, and to see now my son being sworn in as U.S. Senator, all I could think about was only in America. Only in America. What a great journey to see you achieve your dreams, to see you become that servant you want to be to the American people. You know, this has been the realization of my wildest dreams, to see how this country has opened the doors of coming here with nothing and see you achieve such great position of leadership to be able to help so many people across America. I'm so grateful to God for the opportunity and the privilege to be an American.
You know, my whole life, my dad has been my hero. I remember some years back, Heidi and I were having dinner with some friends, and the friends asked, when did you first get interested in politics? And I answered, I said, you know, I don't remember a time when I wasn't. I'm not sure why that is. And at that point, Heidi begins laughing. And you know how sometimes your spouse will see things that are glaringly obvious, and yet you're too obtuse to see them yourself. And she said, well, no wonder. Think of your family. Think of the household you grew up in. And growing up in Houston, as my father's son, it's a tremendous gift to be the child of an immigrant who fled oppression, to be the child of someone who came to America seeking freedom. I remember when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. In our house, politics it wasn't something kind of interesting that you, read the newspaper, that's kind of nice. There was an urgency to it. Because around our dinner table, through my father's eyes, having principled men and women in office is how we protect ourselves from tyranny.
That's right.
And it is truly a blessing. You know, I reflect often about my dad as a teenage kid, 14, 15, 16 years old, fighting in a revolution. Fighting in the Cuban Revolution when he was 17, being thrown in prison and tortured. You know, anytime in my life I've faced a little bit of adversity, it's a very good reality check that anything I'm facing is mild compared to that teenage boy in a Cuban prison being beaten by 4 men with billy clubs. And one of the great blessings of that is it makes you realize just how precious, just how fragile freedom is. That there's no guarantee that we'll remain a free nation unless we stand up and defend that liberty.
That's right. And you know, Ted, I remember when you were 9 years old, that thing really became a daily occasion because that was the beginning of 1980. And I became so engaged in the Reagan campaign. I was involved on the state board of the Religious Roundtable, and our conversation around the dinner table was about politics every day. And I remember how you became mesmerized by watching Ronald Reagan speaking and being involved in debates. And actually, you were as passionate as I was, as a 9-year-old.
Well, it was interesting back then. I remember 1980, the media did everything they could to paint Ronald Reagan as this wild-eyed cowboy from California who was going to lead us into World War III. And I have to admit, in the last couple of years, I've reflected on that because you've seen folks in the media trying to caricature my dad, trying to paint him as somehow extreme. And it's the same game they played back then Look, I understand that folks in the media may find a Christian pastor a little bit foreign to what they know and understand, and they want to ridicule. And they want to ridicule our values and our faith. But I'll tell you, I have never known a more generous man. I've never known a more principled man. I've never known a more courageous man than my father. And frankly, those media hacks who try to go after my dad, I think frankly are out of their league. If they want to attack me, that's fine, knock themselves out. But in trying to tear my father down, they reveal, in trying to tear my father down, they reveal a lot about themselves. They reveal a lot about what they're afraid of. And I'll tell you, I've never known anyone who believes more in the miracle of freedom, who believes more in this country, who loves this country. Listen, when my dad was a scared teenage boy,
Excuse me. Listen, when my dad was a scared teenage boy.
listen, when my dad was a scared teenage boy, America saved him. America gave him hope. This nation has been a beacon to those who are oppressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am so proud to be an American, to really be in the land of opportunity. This is why I get so burdened when I see that opportunity, when I see our freedoms under attack. And Ted, I know you have the answer for America. That's why I think every American needs to support what you're trying to do, and it is to restore America to its former greatness.
The only answer is the same answer we saw in 1980. You know, I think today is very much like the late 1970s. I think Barack Obama is uncannily like Jimmy Carter. Same failed domestic policy, same economic stagnation, misery, malaise, same feckless and naive foreign policy. In fact, exact same countries.
Absolutely.
Russia and Iran laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. And what happened in 1980 is the American people rose up. It was a grassroots movement, swept this country. Millions of men and women rising up. And I'll tell you what gives me encouragement, gives me hope, gives me inspiration, is the same thing's happening again. I see it all over the country. Men and women are waking up. People who've never been involved in politics are standing up and saying, what we're doing isn't working. We got to get back to the values this country was built on. We got to get back to the free market principles, to the constitutional liberties. We got to get back to the land of opportunity that you came to in 1957.
That's right.
You know, you think about that teenage boy at the age of 18, not speaking English, with $100 sewn into his underwear, washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. What an incredible nation that you can come here with nothing and achieve anything. And right now, that opportunity is getting harder and harder for people to realize. It's getting harder and harder for people in my father's situations, teenage immigrants who are here now, harder and harder for single moms, harder and harder for young people, harder and harder for everyone who's struggling. We've got to bring back that opportunity. You know, when my dad came to America, he didn't speak English. He washed dishes, made 50 cents an hour, but very quickly, he learned English. In fact, the way he would learn English, he did a couple of things. One, he was a student at the University of Texas, and he signed up for Spanish 101. And he reverse engineered it. So when the students were hearing leche means milk, he was sitting there writing it backwards. Oh, okay, milk means leche. The other thing he used to do is on Saturdays, he'd go to the movie theaters, and he'd watch the same movie over and over and over again and just start soaking in and absorbing the language.
As a matter of fact, the first month I went to the movies every day. And I did it as work. I would concentrate and try to associate words with actions and words with objects. I did that every day, and in a month, I learned how to think in English.
Well, and if he hadn't learned English, look, he was enrolled at the University of Texas, but his classes were in English. And if he didn't learn English quickly, he was going to flunk out. And if he flunked out, he would have lost his student visa and had to go back to Cuba, and they'd have killed him. But one of the things that I've always admired, so when he learned English, he began traveling around speaking at Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs in and around Austin, and speaking about the Cuban Revolution, speaking in support of Fidel Castro. Now, he didn't know then that Castro was a communist, but this was before the revolution had succeeded, and he'd seen the brutal oppression of Batista. Well, by 1959, the revolution did succeed, and Castro declares to the world he's a communist, begins seizing people's lands, begins executing dissidents. My aunt, my Tia Sonia, his kid sister, was still in Cuba. She begins fighting in the counter-revolution against Castro, and just like my dad, she was thrown in prison and tortured, except she was tortured by Castro's goons. And one of the things my dad did when that happened, he sat down, he made a list of every place he'd gone to speak. And he went back in front of them, he stood in front of them, and he said, I owe you an apology. I misled you. I didn't do so knowingly, but I did so nonetheless, and for that, I'm truly sorry. When I was a kid, my dad told me that story over and over again. And it always impressed me. It was always, I thought, just a powerful statement of character. To take responsibility, to own responsibility, to stand up and apologize. And that's one thing. Growing up, my father always presented an example of courage and integrity. Thank you for being my hero.
Thank you, Ted. I love you. I love you.
I love you too.